I've often heard people say that religion, or Christianity as the case may be, is responsible for more death and suffering than anything else in history. And to support this view, they point at things like the Salem witch trials, or the Crusades, or sometimes even the Nazi Holocaust, and say, see, this is what religion does. Religion has caused more death and suffering than anything else. I'd like to address that point because I don't think that's a fair inference, nor do I believe it's factually correct. I don't believe that religion is indeed the greatest single murderer of all time, so to speak. And I think the facts make that abundantly clear. Before proceeding to that point, though, I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to present an argument for or against God, nor am I trying to present an argument for or against the Bible. Those are wonderful topics to discuss, certainly worthy of discussion, but those aren't the points I'm trying to address. I'm trying to address a very specific point about this accusation made against religion and or Christianity. I feel the need to emphasize this because I've discovered that when this topic comes up, a lot of people interject by saying, well, I still don't believe in a God, and here's why, blah, blah, blah. Like I said, that's a valid topic of discussion, but it's not the point I'm trying to address. And I say this so that I hope that if some discussion comes of this video, that we can keep it on track. I urge people to get a copy of the Guinness Book of World Records. Open up to the category titled Judicial and look up the subsection titled Mass Killings. Who are the greatest murderers of all history? Well, let's take a look. Okay. The greatest massacre ever imputed by the government of a country was committed under Mao Zedong between the years of 1949 and May 1965. There were about 26.3 million Chinese that were killed during that time. Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn estimated that under Lenin and Stalin and Khrushchev, about 66.7 people were killed as a result of state repression and terrorism. A more obscure individual is Pol Pot, still well known but not as notorious as these other fellas. He killed a third of his country. A third of his countrymen were killed between April 17, 1975 and January 1979. Okay. Tragic. I mean, that story just boggles my mind. Other instances of great mass murders. China, unfortunately, has had an unpleasant history in this regard. During the Mongolian invasion of northern China, about 35 million people were killed. And under bandit leader Chiang Hien-shung, otherwise known as the Yellow Tiger, there were about 40 million people killed. So, to summarize, you got 26.3 million Chinese under Mao Zedong. You've got 66.7 million under the Soviet Union, under Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev. You got Pol Pot killing 1/3 of his entire country, 1/3 of 8 million Cambodians. You had other massacres in Chinese history amounting to 35 million and 40 million people. What do you notice about these massacres? None of them were religiously motivated. And these are the ones that occupy the highest ranks in the Guinness Book of World Records. In fact, all but the last of these actually affirm atheism. All but the last of these actually were the result of atheistic regimes. And what do we mean by an atheistic regime? I mean a regime where atheism was promoted and where religion was outlawed. The greatest murders of all time occurred in places where religion was stamped out, not where religion was allowed to flourish. Now, some people get very angry when I mention this. Some people say, how can you say that atheism teaches we should massacre people? Atheism teaches no such thing. I'm not trying to say that. I'm not saying that atheism teaches that. I'm just showing what the record of history says. That it's when you remove religion that these things have tended to occur. Consider the track record under religion. What happens with the under the Crusades, for example. Now with the Crusades were a tragic event. I'm not going to make any excuses for it. This was, I do not condone the Crusades by any means. But how many people were killed? Over the course of a couple of hundred years, you had, tens of thousands of people were killed in the Crusades. That was tragic. But the numbers do not approach the numbers, the atrocities committed under these atheistic regimes. What about the Salem witch trials? Well, in the Salem witch trials, you had something like 35 people killed. There were similar witch hunts that were conducted in Europe, and you had many thousands of people who were killed there as well. Over the course of 300 years, we're talking about 300,000. Again, a horrible number, but nowhere near the numbers that occurred under regimes where religion was eliminated. Okay? Like I said, I'm not saying that these things were acceptable. Not at all. These things were the result of twisting religion and Christianity in particular. These actions were performed contrary to Christian teaching. They were not taught by Christianity, they were performed in violation of what Christianity actually teaches. This goes to show that people can take religion and twist it for their own purposes. Some people point to Hitler and say Hitler was a Catholic and he killed 11 million people, 6 million Jews. Well, first of all, Hitler was not acting in accordance with Christian principles. I think it's unfair to blame Christianity for Hitler. Second, he professed to be Catholic, but he gave mixed signals at best. He also dabbled in a lot of neo-pagan practices. As one historian I read said, Hitler was clearly straddling both sides of the fence. It seemed like he didn't want to oppose religion outright, knowing he couldn't get away with it. And so he tried to pander to both the Christianity, in particular Catholicism, and to pagan religions, and some even speculate that Hitler thought of himself as God. By the way, it's also worth noting that Hitler's numbers, while tragic as well, do not approach the numbers committed by these other individuals. How does his 11 million compare to, say, the 66.7 million committed under Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev, for example? So like I said, it's really unfair to blame religion and Christianity for these things. The facts pretty clearly show that religion is not responsible for the greatest murders of all time. Okay. Some would say, well, okay, so it's not responsible for the greatest number of killings, but it's still responsible for more suffering than anything else in history. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to substantiate that claim. It seems to me that this is a pretty good indication of the amount of suffering that occurs. These numbers that I just gave. And now, if you're going to make some vague claim about how religion is still responsible for more suffering than anything else, I'd like to see some hard numbers. I'd like to see how you actually arrived at those figures. Because frankly, I cannot find any way to substantiate that claim. One last point. I mentioned that atheism does not teach that you should go out and massacre people, and I really believe that. At the same time, and I know this might upset people, I think it's worth asking, these individuals, these regimes that massacred people by the millions, is it at all unreasonable to surmise that they might have been less willing to kill 35, 40, 66.7 million people, etc., if they believed that there was a God to whom they would be ultimately accountable? I don't think that's an altogether unreasonable thing to surmise. It's like Dennis Prager says, if you're walking down an alley and you see a bunch of people, a bunch of tough-looking fellas walking toward you, would you feel better knowing that they had just come from a Bible study? I think most of us would be. So, for these reasons, I think it's very unfair to say that Christianity and religion have that track record, to say that the blame for the greatest murders, the greatest killings, the most suffering in all history should be laid at their feet. That's not a fair accusation.